You know, it's interesting how when you read the scriptures, occasionally a phrase or something comes to your mind. And I'm not exactly sure why this came to my mind. Maybe it was the second reading inspired me. But I thought of the 1995 song by Joan Osborne, and the chorus went, "What if God was one of us, just a slob like one of us, just a stranger on the bus?" I'm sure many of you remember that. And I think in that second reading, one of the beautiful things about Jesus being the high priest is he was one of us, just a slob like one of us. And I really think art has done a disfavor to us because we see pictures of Jesus dressed in these marvelous robes and things like that, and we forget that Jesus was a peasant. He was a worker. Now, we call him a carpenter. The Greek word is tekton, which just means he worked with his hands. And there's not a whole lot of wood in Galilee, so he probably didn't do a whole lot of sawing and cutting of wood. And some biblical experts think that there was a city being built not too far from Nazareth, Sephora, I think the name of it is, and they believe that he probably was one of the workers that went over there to work on building Sephora. And if he did, then he was with many other workers, people like him. And so these are the men that are on the lowest level of the political or social ladder. And in fact, at the time of Jesus, throughout the Roman Empire, and particularly in Nazareth or in Galilee or even in Israel, about 90% of the people were on the lowest rung of the ladder. Only about 10% of the people had money, power, or whatever it was. Most of them were at the lowest level. And so these are the people that Jesus lived with, worked with, ate with, partied with, and went on. And it was difficult. And most of his disciples, as far as we can make out, came from the same area. We know that Peter, Andrew, James, and John were fishermen, which was not a highly productive, although they probably were roughly in the middle class, because if they had good catches, they made fairly good money. We know that Matthew was a tax collector, so he probably had a pretty good bank account. We don't know much about the rest of them, but we can assume that they were all kind of along those lines. And so you can sort of understand why James and John, being oppressed by the Romans, being oppressed by the local government, said, yeah, when we're in charge, when Jesus is in charge, we want to be right there with him, and we want to exert our authority. And Jesus is going, whoa, 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 this is not what I came here to do. Jesus wanted to train them in how to be his disciples, not what they wanted to become, but what he wanted them to become. And they were going to have to change their focus on life, on what they were expecting. And I think many of us who read the Bible fairly regularly realize that, at least in the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the disciples don't seem to really understand what Jesus' mission is until the resurrection. They went through all that time with him and didn't understand him. And Jesus is beginning to show them the way. Today's the 29th Sunday in Ordinary Time. For those of you that don't know, there's only 34 Sundays in Ordinary Time, so that means we got 5 more Sundays, 6 more Sundays to Advent. So how many days is that to Christmas? Anyway, and so the readings that we're seeing now in the Gospel particularly are leaning towards the future, what's going to happen after the resurrection, and what's going to happen. And so Jesus is beginning to train his disciples. And we too must realign our focus to be a disciple of Jesus. Now, I'd say in today's gospel, Jesus identifies 3 things his disciples must understand and work towards. And the first is the relevance of status. The second is the cost of discipleship. And the third is to be service, to be a slave to all. Now, as I said, with dealing with status, James and John wanted to be the big dogs in the future coming of Jesus. And they were thinking as humans do, not as God does. They were thinking about how the Romans, how the authorities lorded it over them, and they wanted to be like that. And Jesus says, that's not what we do in our community. That is not what we want in building the kingdom of God. And to get to the kingdom of God, Jesus provided kind of a job description of a true disciple. He asked two questions. Can you drink the cup that we will drink, that he will drink? And can you be baptized with which he would be baptized? Now, on the surface, those may seem like, what the heck's he talking about? And unfortunately, Jesus does that a lot, doesn't he? He says things and we kind of say, what's he getting around? Anyway, a cup is figuratively linked to one's inheritance or destiny. And there are references in the Psalms to the cup and its meaning, and it's often referred to, I will raise the cup of salvation. And so cup is used that way. But cup is also a symbol of suffering. And if you remember, when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, he asked God to take this cup from me if you can, that cup of suffering. So cup references, in this case, to suffering. And that's something that a disciple is going to need to do. Now, when we look at baptism, it connotes a change of heart. Now, I know we baptize babies, and there's not much they're going to change when they're 3 or 4 months old at the most, or something like that. But for adults, it really is a change of heart. That's why we have a fairly extensive OCIA program. It's going to be the Order of Christian Initiation, starting 1 November. Order of Christian Initiation, to train people because we're expecting them to change their life. And it signifies being plunged into suffering and going through the throes of death to emerge into new life. Going back to the idea of baptism and going into the water, one of the things I often stress in baptisms is that at the time of Jesus, very few people swam. I mean, we see this in the story of Peter, Jesus walking across the water, and Peter says, tell me to come, and he comes, and Peter starts sinking. Peter couldn't swim. I know it's hard to believe a fisherman can't swim, but today, I understand in the Philippines, many fishermen can't swim because it's not part of their job. And so at the time of Jesus, very few people. So water, particularly water that was over your head, was chaos to them. It was very fearful. They were afraid of it. And so Jesus is telling us you have to plunge into that chaos and then come back up out of it and to emerge into new life. It calls for a change of heart. So both the cup and baptism suggest links to his impending death. Now Jesus goes on to tell his disciples that you must be a slave to all. Now that seems like an interesting statement. Slave, but we're against slavery. We don't want slavery. Well, he's not talking about the slavery that we are aware of from the prior to the Civil War. It's an idea of being devoted to somebody so much, like you're a servant to them. It's loving service. And think of it, it's how a parent takes care of a sick child. They're with them. What is it they want? Can I get the right medicine? Can I do this? Can I do that? You're almost a slave to that person. Or someone who's caring for a spouse with a terminal disease. They try to do all they can to take care of that person, to make their final days peaceful at best they can do. And to highlight what I consider two examples of this idea of being a slave to all, I have two stories, and they're very similar. But I found it interesting because one takes place in Korea and the other takes place in India. But during the Korean War, a woman correspondent happened upon a clinic in Busan, South Korea, where she found a nun on her knees cleaning the gangrenous sore on a man's leg. Sister, the correspondent said, I wouldn't do that for $1 million. The nun looked up and said, neither would I. The story is told of Sister Mercy Hirschbeck, Marano's first sister doctor, and it made headlines around the world. Apparently, she published it. Similarly, in India, missionaries of charity were tending to the poorest of the poor on the streets of Calcutta. They happened across a man lying in the gutter very near death. He was filthy, dressed in little more than a rag, and flies were swarmed around his body. Immediately, Mother Teresa embraced him, spoke to him softly, and began to pick out the maggots that were nesting in his flesh. A passerby was repulsed by the sight of the man and exclaimed to Mother Teresa, I wouldn't do that for $1 million. And she replied, neither would I. Obviously, monetary gain did not motivate the diminutive woman known as the Saint of Calcutta. Jesus was preparing his disciples to build the kingdom of God here on earth. He is also teaching them it will not be like the kingdoms they are familiar with. The kingdom of God will be led by people who shun status, are ready for the hardships of the mission, and serve others in almost slave-like devotion to all out of love. We are called to go forth and do likewise.